Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administration exam. Well, what we're going to talk about now in our network file systems and file servers section is we're going to talk about how to provide and configure network shares via NFS, and we'll split this into two separate videos. The first, we will create and install what we need to export shares for our server, and then we will configure our client to mount and then access those and show how those files are written across the different file systems. So NFS stands for Network File System, and although we are doing this using CentOS, the process is very similar for Ubuntu or Debian-based systems. It uses the NFS utilities, RPC bind, and the NFS libraries. If you're using Debian or Ubuntu, you would do a sudo apt-get install on NFS utils and the utils lib. In CentOS, we'll do a yum install as follows. Let's go ahead and just become root here on our CentOS system. And actually, we're going to SSH to our server system, which I believe we're actually on right now. We are. Okay, so let's go ahead, now that we're root, we'll go ahead and use yum to install the utilities and libraries that we need. So if we do a sudo, well, we're actually root, so we don't need to do that. We'll do a yum install nfs-utils and nfs-utils lib. And this will install what we need to from a server perspective to create our NFS exports. And when you are creating a file share on a server, whether it's Samba or NFS, you'll often hear it referred to as exporting a file system, which is what we're going to do. So in this case, we do have the NFS utilities and the libraries already installed. If you don't, that will install it for you. The next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and create the appropriate links for our NFS service so that it happens on start. So in our case, we're using a CentOS 6 system, so we're going to do a check config. If this were a system D system, we would do systemctl or system control enable. In this case, we're doing check config NFS on. And then we're going to go ahead and start it, which we can do with a service NFS start. And we'll see that it starts services, quotas, mount, daemon, and RPC. So RPC bind is something that you'll find that you need. If you're using CentOS 7, RPC bind will already be installed, but it will also rely on RPC. So now that NFS service is started, as well as the NFS utilities are installed, we need to create the directories that we want to export to our client applications or servers. So let's go ahead and let's assume that the first export we want to do is the home directory. So home right now just contains tcox, that would be me, and I want to be able to mount that as a drive on a secondary system. We'll also create another directory in var, and we'll just call that directory share. So I've got in the var directory, I've got make directory and share. Now what I want to make sure is that I assign the appropriate permissions for how I want users to access my file system. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and do a chmod on the share file system 755 for share. Now when we mount our file system on the client, we'll see, we'll take a look at what those file system permissions look like, but the permissions for being able to mount it are handled by a file called etc exports. Now, if we take a look at, we'll go ahead and clear our screen here. If we take a look at what the exports file looks like, because it's a server export table, there is a man page for it. So if you look here, it says that the etc exports contains a table of local physical file systems on an NFS server that are accessible to NFS clients. Now, the contents of the file are maintained by the server system administrator. That would be you. So what we have to do is we have to set up in this file what file systems, and we just talked about, we want home and var share to be exported so that the file systems can be mounted remotely. If we look through the man page, there's a number of different things that you'll want to be available, export types. Whether you want to do it read-write, read-only, if you want the file system to cache writes, if you want to remap user IDs, etc. And we'll put those into our exports file. So we'll see where that goes. So right now, if we want to create our exports, we're going to edit the Etsy exports file. So if we look at our Etsy exports file, right now there's no entry, but all we need to put here is who we want to access which directories and under what circumstances. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add each of the lines. So the first one would be the home directory. So in that home directory, we want certain IP addresses to be able to access that file system. Now, if we were to put, for example, here 0.0.0.0/24, that would effectively mean that any IP address could then mount that file system. But since this is a share that we want to restrict, in this case, I'm going to restrict it to the private network 192.168.1.0/24, which means any address on the class C 192.168.1.1 through 255. So anybody on that network has the ability to mount the file system designated as home. Now what we're going to do is, here's where we're going to add options. So the first thing we want to do is we want to say we want read-write, comma, and then we're going to say no root squash. Now what in the world does that mean? Well, no root squash means turn off root squashing. And what root squashing is it maps requests from the user or group ID 0, the root user, to the anonymous user ID and group ID. So what this keeps from happening is the root user on the originating file system has a user or group ID that would normally be duplicated on the root user of the group ID or user ID of the remote system. We don't want those two user IDs to conflict so that permissions aren't managed even if it's the root user. So by remapping it to the anonymous user ID, we don't have that, we squash that root problem. In this case, we're saying turn off root squashing, and a lot of times this is used for diskless clients, but the root squash is it can be used for additional security. In this case, it's not really an issue for us. We also want to do a mount to var share, and we also want it only to be available 192.168.1.0/24, and the only option we're going to put here is read-only. So the var share directory is read-only. For example, if I wanted to share log files that an application can use by importing or reading them, but I don't want any changes to be made because I don't want them reflected on the originating file system. So if we go ahead and hit close here by saving the file, and then we'll have to restart our NFS server. So but the first thing we need to do is we need to do export fs-a. That exports the file system from the exports file, and then we do, in this case, a service NFS restart, which will restart all of the NFS and RPC services on our NFS server. Now, once that has been done, then we can go over to our client, configure our client for mounting those file systems, and then test how the different permissions work on our client system. So our NFS server is set up. We've got two file systems exported, one read-only and one with read-write access for the appropriate users. That's all there is for setting up and making available our NFS server mounts, exporting the file systems. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.